Here we're going to get started painting over the first image. So first I get my cycles render out, I get out a mist pass, and then I also separate out, based on depth, different layers that I'm going to separate the scene into. And I go over this in a later video where I kind of just talk about my Blender setup, how I export renders, and also there's a section about add-ons and kind of tips and tricks that I do in Blender. So the first thing for the Paintover though is I started trying out different skies. So I got these skies from different photo bash packs, and it's trying to get the mood of the sky is really important. And then after that, as you see, I'm going to work from background to foreground. So I'm going to start getting the mood of these background mountains in. I often like to vignette them from the top down, where they kind of fall into shadow. And in addition to this, now we can start adding atmosphere too. So atmosphere and light and shadow is how we're going to get a lot of separation for this image. And that's kind of what I was planning on from the very beginning, is having good atmosphere separation for this stuff. And the atmosphere too can be not just in the main layers, but also within the structures to get depth. So the back mountain is so large that it should have layers of atmosphere. So I have these cloud shapes that I'm going to use, and then I'm going to paint into them and mask them, and then make sure that there's light hitting them from the top. And then I'm kind of going to go through and edit them to make sure they're not clipping through things, edit them with masks. And this whole thing is going to be as non-destructible as possible. So first we're going to start getting the cloud separation in, and then we're going to start painting. I'm doing a little bit of just like color and value tweaking on the top. I'll create an adjustments folder and do a little bit of color lookup, a little bit of overlay, just to kind of test out and see how the values are looking. And I'll kind of do this periodically through the image, just so I can kind of like make sure it's going in the right direction. And we want to have very good separation between, especially like between elements such as the foreground and the elements behind that. Good separation is going to help a lot with depth. Switching to black and white mode will kind of help you see the values much easier when you don't have to worry about color. So this is a really good way just to check that the black and white read is working, because this is kind of the most, I would say it's the most important read. Colors would be secondary, but it needs to read good just in black and white values. And here we're going to start just kind of layering over a little bit of photo. I'm going to like kind of use it here and there, trying out some masking. I got these great light shapes in from the render, so I'm gonna probably try to keep these shapes as much as I can in certain areas. So here I'm just trying out different types of like curves layers. I'm gonna probably reduce the opacity so it comes through. You'll see if I kind of try it out. It never hurts to try it out, and you can always take it off if you don't want it. And then for something like this, I'm going to be like, there's a lot of detail. There's a bit more detail I want to add onto the mountain to help it feel larger. So a photo that I can kind of layer on and kind of just like kind of mix in a little bit with a blend if, or an overlay mode, or darken or lighten will really help just kind of get a little bit more detail into that mountain, because you want the scale to feel right. When you think about how large a person is, you want to make sure that the scale is correct. And now I'm starting to also paint over a little bit. So with paint, I can kind of like correct any mistakes. I can kind of tone things back. I can paint a little bit more detail. So it's important to always know that you can't, try not to leave it as raw, as a raw render everywhere. Try to like paint a little bit, areas that you think aren't feeling right. And then this background mountain shape, it was kind of drawing too much attention. The silhouette is getting a little bit complex on that side, so I'm like trying to paint out areas, simplify it. Since it's not the focal point, it shouldn't draw too much attention. So just a cleaner read. And same thing with how I'm painting out this part too. You don't need a very noisy mountains in the back, so like I'll kind of paint it out just to simplify it a bit. And then for the main mountain too, I want to kind of like keep the top of the main mountain where the focal point is the most complex. And then as it kind of like goes down, I want to simplify the shape and the silhouette a bit, because we don't really need that much detail there. So you get a little bit of contrast, and you don't have to look at that kind of like side slope so much. And there's going to be just more atmosphere and value tweaking as we go. And kind of cleaning up areas that might seem a little off, a little sharp. If an area is feeling flat, lay over some photo texture, reduce opacity, match the value in black and white, and then mask it in and out just a little bit. Here I'm just adding a little bit of bloom to the lights. So you could also get a bloom export from Blender, which I do kind of at the end, or you can just kind of paint in the bloom manually. So I kind of will do a combination of both. And then painting highlights. This kind of like will help give it a slightly more painterly look and reduce the 3D look a bit when you paint highlights on certain areas, especially where planes overlap. When objects overlap, you kind of can emphasize what's in front of the other one with a highlight. Similar as you would when drawing, you might give like a thicker edge to something in front of something that's behind it. And I'm going to just work on the sky a little bit more. I'm like thinking maybe I want some like clouds up there. I'm going to kind of like play around with like, maybe I want like a darker shape at the top instead of lighter, so it kind of like brings you down into the image. When you're painting, I try not to, especially since I want this to feel very realistic, I don't want to have any like overly large brush strokes. I don't want to kind of like destroy a lot of the work that I put in the 3D. So like kind of like carefully painting is important to not feel like it's going to stand out. You don't want the brush strokes to stand out, especially on an image like this. And then playing around with edges. So for instance, on this background mountain, I don't really need hard edges along the whole way. So I'm playing around with like losing an edge, like losing the edge a little bit in certain parts. So it'll just kind of like not have the tension there, which is nice. And it's important to kind of stay pretty organized with your layers if you possibly can. So as you're adding atmosphere and painting and this image goes further and further, that you can always like, it just helps to edit the image later. It helps when you keep things organized. Finding areas to add just a little bit of separation so it doesn't feel like the raw render. It feels like there's a lot of atmosphere in the scene. Things are clearly in front of other things. And I was also still trying out more skies. I ended up kind of just trying out different versions for a bit. And then kind of painting a bit, adding vignettes to certain areas that by kind of getting a little bit of a gradient with lighting, it kind of helps things feel less flat. So you definitely don't want to ever have like, if you can avoid it, having, when you have a large area, like a wall or rooftop, you think about it as a shape, you want a slight vignette of light and ideally color a little bit. Just a little bit will give it more depth than like having it feel like it's lit exactly the same across the whole surface. And then that back mountain, I'm like, oh, it's drawing a little bit too much attention. It's pretty far back, so why don't I just cover it a bit more in atmosphere? So we don't need that there. And then I'm feeling the same with these other back mountains too. That they're not the main focal of the piece, even though I spent time on them, like getting interesting silhouettes and things back there. It would actually help the piece if they didn't read as much, since they draw too much attention. So lose the edge, trying to draw less attention, less contrast in those areas. And then I'm playing around with the shape of that mountain too. here it's getting like pretty close to where I'm like I'll be calling it finished. So I'm trying out just different color things, just to see if there's certain color feelings that I might want more bluish, more greenish, more warm or cool. It's sometimes fun to do this at this stage because since the values are set, a little bit of color tweaking looks good. And then the water was drawing a little bit of attention, so here I'm going to like paint the render just a little bit, just to help match it and not like feel so 3D. It don't need that much painting. You kind of just want it to feel like it matches everything else, and you kind of like break up the shapes a little bit. So if the shapes ever feel too flat, kind of just break it from the render, just break it up a little bit with a little paint. Or if they're drawing too much attention, you can just simplify it with paint. And then this is how I will kind of spend probably the rest of the time in this image, is just tweaking areas to make it draw less attention. So the focal point's always the top of the mountain. Like if it's anything that's drawing too much attention from that, we're gonna just kind of try to paint it back a little bit, simplify it. Some like color tweaking. Do I want it to feel more blue? I kind of decided on something a little bit grayer and not as blue. I wanted it to feel like really moody, and I wanted a lot of the color to come from the warm lights rather than the blue light, rather than like a blue piece. So a little bit grayer, so you get a little bit of like that warm and a tiny bit of greenish on the water. Kind of like the look of that.